Hi Erin Corber. We are here at the New York College Library, and I would like to discuss a bit about your project here. Before moving to the core of your project here, I would like to ask you a bit about your personal and academic background.
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Before coming here, I was a visiting assistant professor of European history at the University of Maine. I completed my PhD in 2013 at Indiana University in Bloomington. And the rest of my education, undergraduate and undergraduate education, was in Canada at McGill University and the University of Toronto for my master's degree.
So your dissertation was about interwar French history period, and more specifically about the rebuilding of Jewish communities in this interwar period between 1918 and 1940.
Right.
Could you tell me a bit about your dissertation? What was the main focus of it?
Sure. Well, I've always been interested in the First World War, and initially I really wanted to write a dissertation on Jewish experiences of the First World War in France. But when I started doing my research, I found that the more interesting story was in what the war did afterwards, or left behind. And what I found was that Reconstruction, sort of as a communal project and a sort of individual project, looked quite different for Jewish communities. In sort of structure, it was quite familiar to the Reconstruction projects we see more broadly in France and in Europe writ large, but the meanings were quite different. And it seemed to me that in terms of the sort of Jewish historical narrative, the post-World War I period had been almost completely obscured in terms of sort of Reconstruction projects by the Second World War and the Holocaust. So my goal really was to recover a moment in French Jewish history that really had been obscured by catastrophe after the Second World War. And what I found, the main argument that my dissertation puts forth, is that French Jewish communities, in all their increasing diversity in the interwar period, this is a community that's becoming increasingly diverse because of migration movements from Eastern Europe, and then again after 1933 by refugee movements, or movements of refugees rather, from Central and East Central Europe, European countries, that these Reconstruction projects really all come together around concerns for and discourses of the body, health and wellness. And this for me was an interesting line of pursuit, given the focus on sort of the intellectual and cultural history of Jews. This is a group of people that has been sort of understood writ large as a sort of people of the book. And what I've tried to demonstrate is that really in the interwar years, Jews of all stripes were people of the body as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So that was the focus of your dissertation, and the current project here, the Social Life of Anti-Semitism in Alsace-Lorraine between 1933 and 1940, it's a continuation of that in a way. Moving from a kind of national country, all country focus in your dissertation on the diversity of Jewish communities in France to a more specific region. And why is that? I mean, what is the motivation and the kind of driving force for this particular project on a kind of more regional focus?
Well, there are lots of reasons why there are lots of potential backgrounds for the genesis of this project. The main sort of reasoning behind moving to one region and moving to this region is really quite simply that the archives were just so intriguing to me when I went to do a portion of my research in Strasbourg. And I also did some research in Colmar for my dissertation. And it seemed to me that the archives telling the same story that I've been reading, or that I had been reading in the archives all through France in a number of places, really was quite different in the borderlands. And the research that I've been able to pursue here at NEC really confirms that these narratives that historians have, or that sort of popular culture holds about the refugee crisis after 1933 in France, really do look different on the ground, or look differently rather on the ground in some of these places. Now, in Alsace-Lorraine, which is an intriguing area to begin with, really it had been annexed to the imperial German territories after 1871, reincorporated into the French Republic after the First World War, and really a quite politically unique area that had fought tooth and nail to retain its traditions after reincorporation into the Republic. That their responses to international events, and in particular an international event happening quite literally only a few kilometers away from them on the border, that would look very different than it would in Paris, in the capital, or in cities and towns in the interior. And to be a little bit more specific, I can think of the case of the plebiscite in 1935 in the Saarland, which for years before the Saarland, which I guess they had been under international control since the end of the First World War. In the years leading up to this plebiscite that would give people living in the Saarland the opportunity to choose whether they would be reincorporated into Germany or would remain either international or go back to France, French authorities in these formerly German territories were really quite concerned that masses of refugees would be coming into these areas. And they were quite right that political refugees, communists for instance, and many, many Jews would be coming into France via these eastern borders. So, this is all to say that the refugee crisis and the rise of the Third Reich and its associated policies, which became increasingly radical, that people living in these areas and people administering these areas on the borderlands were quite concerned in very visceral and visible ways. And the refugee crisis came to happen in sort of very visceral and visible ways as well in these areas. So, this sort of recasting or reimagining of a history in a much more kind of concrete fashion really appealed to me when I started thinking about what makes French history on the margins different than French history in the center. Of course, this is the history of the same country, but I really do think that micro-histories and local histories have a lot to add to our understanding of national events, and even in this case, particular transnational events, as an area that really straddles two cultures and straddles two sets of politics.
In this very tension period, 1930s, you have this, and the Jewish communities are in between the French state policy of incorporation of these territories. You have German, the rise of German National Socialist movement, and you have the Tsar Legion with tensions there. And you have the Jewish communities that benefited during the late imperial German period of this, development of Strasbourg and regions, urbanization, modernization, and they are, moving under the state, French state sovereignty. How they deal with all these changes? I mean, how their experience is reflected in this new context?
Okay, well, the period is, as you said, full of different types of tensions. This region is uniquely impacted by many of these in very sort of concrete ways. And you're right that Jewish communities do benefit in some way, in some interesting ways, by development initiated by the imperial German or by the German Empire during this period. And I wrote an article about this, about the Jewish community in late, I guess this would be in late interwar Strasbourg in 1938, where I sort of track the development of the Jewish community in a city like Strasbourg, which was so developed under the German, during the German period, that it's sort of impossible to see the city's development without the development of the Jewish community. This is the period where the Great Synagogue was built in the late 19th century. This is a synagogue that eventually was burned down by the Nazis. It's no longer there. But it was a period of growth. That said, Jews in this region, whether they had benefited from the sort of German expansion and development of a city like Strasbourg, or whether, even German Jewish communities that had been resettled in this area, they were well aware that there was really no future under the imperial structure for them, and that whether or not Imperial Germany was able to sort of expand their urban settings and provide them with a sort of modern city, just to be specific, that it was really the Republican system that was going to offer them the best deal. And so what we see after the sort of reincorporation of these territories is a sort of reaffirmation of commitment and dedication and love for the French Republic. This is a really big part of the French Jewish narrative, and it's extremely important to understanding Jewish communities in Alsace-Lorraine, overjoyed when there are these stories of communities being overjoyed when the French soldiers walk into these cities and liberate them in 1918. Really, when we talk about Alsatian nationalism, there isn't really much of a Jewish presence in these movements, because Alsatian nationalism was a sort of reaction against the centralizing, secularizing impulses of the Republic. French Jewish communities really benefited from all of these sort of Republican structures. So there's a long relationship between Jewish communities and Republican ideology and the Republican state structure. But these sort of irredentist, separatist, sovereigntist movements really didn't have much of a Jewish character, as much as we might think when we think about the sort of presence of Jewish life and Jewish institutions in this area.
It was the richness of the local archives, the peculiar situation of Alsace-Lorraine after the incorporation into the French state after 1918 made this region and the experience of the Jewish communities in this region appealing to you, mm-hmm. to this project. Mm-hmm. How does one go to study the social life of the everyday experience of anti-Semitism mm-hmm. In these communities, urban and rural? It's like what are your sources and how you go?
Mm-hmm. Well, the idea was to return to a set of local and municipal and departmental archives. This is what I aimed to do here. This is what I will continue to do as I develop this project. When you're studying a local sort of community, I feel very lucky to be studying France because the archive organization is quite good. I could start off with the departmental archives, and I could move into municipal and Jewish communal archives, which I will be consulting. I didn't consult this time for my work here at NEC, but I will be consulting them in microfilm form or microfiche form at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum at a postdoc I began there in August. So this is something still in development. In terms of sort of everyday experiences, what I've found I've been doing for my sort of first incarnations of this project in writing is reading official documents against the grain. And what that means for me is looking at these official documents that look quite repetitive. For instance, the memos and recommendations regarding refugee requests for visas. These look quite similar to one another. They're quite official, but actually individuals wrote them for other individuals, and these groups of people had a set of ideas and attitudes that are definitely worth looking into. So what I've been doing with, for instance, this set of documents is to sort of find out what kinds of languages, what kinds of attitudes do these individuals hold that would sort of color or distinguish these records from perhaps popular or commonly held visions of what's happening in Alsace. And it's quite interesting to sort of see these individual attitudes develop as I read through these documents. I would say too that as this project becomes more sort of deeply engaged in, or as I become more deeply engaged in the research for this project, I would like to spend more time with press sources, and something that takes quite a bit more time in my experience doing my dissertation research was locating and sort of identifying primary source personal collections, which is, it really does take a while. It takes time, to be in the community, to make contacts, to speak to people, to have multiple conversations with individuals who are willing to sort of over time share personal reflections. And of course, 6 years ago, this was a little bit easier when I was doing my dissertation research. The people that grew up in France, in Alsace-Lorraine, in Strasbourg, and other cities in the 1930s are more elderly now. So it does, there is a bit of a clock, unfortunately, and these things do take some time. And just to sort of bring it back to this subject of reading the everyday experiences, I think this is really a sort of a way to get away from these Paris-dominated narratives of anti-Semitism and of politics and culture in general. Really these sort of capital-centered, ideologically or politically, motivated phenomena. And my sort of goal here is to uncover a set of interactions, and in order to do this, I have to look at as many papers as possible to sort of draw these stories out. And I would say that these sources really are in these local archives.
In this discussion about anti-Semitism, is it an indigenous local phenomenon that has a continuity? Is it something that is an influence of Nazi Germany and Nazi anti-Semitic policies? How you would place the case of Alsace-Lorraine?
Yeah.
I mean, do you see continuities, ruptures, influences in this context?
So this is another intriguing part of Alsace-Lorraine for me. The sort of dominating narrative of French anti-Semitism, French indigenous anti-Semitism, is that it was some sort of a failing of Republican politics and Republican ideology, really. There was no place for Jews really in this as Jews. This is the sort of story that comes to color people's understanding of why, for instance, France never went Nazi in the same way that Germany did, to be crude. And but what we see in a place like Alsace-Lorraine is that there are nodes where anti-Semitism is coming from that aren't part of this sort of Republican story. And this is to say, these sort of more traditional locales that were allowed to flourish and that held really important roles in sort of late 19th century and early 20th century life in these borderlands, and that would be the church in these rural areas. And through reading, I've had time to read through a lot of French sort of local studies on this when I was in Alsace doing my research for NEC, and continuing here back in Bucharest while I'm trying to piece this together, is that during this period of upheaval in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, the region comes to sort of close in on itself, at least in the countryside, and sort of hold fast to its traditions. And this really, I think, gives Alsace-Lorraine a sort of unique, it gives its story of anti-Semitism a little bit of a unique spin. I would also say that, you know, the sort of rise of National Socialism in Germany is not completely separated from what's happening in this area, in spite of the region being reincorporated into France. During the 1920s and 30s, Alsace-Lorraine sees the rise of separatist and sort of Alsatian nationalist groups, which take a lot of their inspiration from nationalist movements in Germany. Many of them are pro-German in culture. They see there's really no place for Alsatian regional peculiarity and sort of the retaining of Alsatian culture in the French context. They look to Germany and see a future potentially there. And so this also gives the region its a peculiarity that you really don't see in places like Paris or in other regions in the interior.
You have this incident in 1937.
In 1937. And what happens is Cecile Brunschwig, who is an undersecretary, again, interesting to note, one of 3 women ministers appointed by Leo Blum, the Jewish prime minister of the Popular Front in the 1930s. So really what we see here is a sort of socialist, a female representative of a socialist government, of a Jewish prime minister in a moment of massive crisis and upheaval at the university, the sort of arrival of students coming from Germany, students coming from Eastern Europe via Germany, transferring their degrees and their credits, getting jobs in labs. There's evidence of this in the archives as well. Protests among sort of faculty administrations to having an increase of people to have to deal with funding. Anyway, all this to say is that the sort of protest, which is how it looks on the ground to the prefect and to these sort of reports, or through these reports to the prefect, is that it's a massive anti-Semitic protest. And in fact, there is a lot of anti-Jewish rhetoric and anti-Semitic sort of words and acts that are being sort of unleashed during this few hours. I think it was the afternoon in late February. But actually what is quite interesting is to sort of examine, and this is what I try to do in the paper, examine this very complex moment, really literally a moment, through different sort of parties' experiences and accounts of it. So I've been able to look at some sort of records of the protesters themselves, what they thought they were saying, what they thought they were doing, what the meanings were behind these acts and these words, to recover the local Jewish community's responses to this, the faculty administration, and the sort of municipal and regional authorities' responses to all of this. And what I found is that something as simple as saying, oh, you know, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Alsace during this period, and this was an anti-Semitic moment, is actually, you know, much more complicated. And this, I find, is not excusing the words and the acts of people involved in movements like this at all. But what it does really is try to understand them in a more sort of local and deep context, understand what these acts meant, what these words meant for the people employing them, and the sort of differing accounts give us a number of sort of conflicts, even within these protests that deserve closer examination, that can reveal a lot about the nature of what we understand to be anti-Semitism, and what is so frequently, I think, sort of swept into a sort of bigger, a bigger umbrella category of people who hate Jews. What I think is quite interesting about this, especially doing this project right now, is that it offers us a way, or it suggests the importance of looking at racist and racial acts and sort of words and behavior in a much more deep context. It takes the things that people say seriously in an attempt to understand where these energies and these ideas are coming from. I think something that's quite important, especially right now, we're dealing with a rise just this week after the British exit from the EU, to sort of understand where these ideas and these behaviors are coming from and how to address them.
That's very interesting, like the situation, this focus point of this event, of trying to understand the kind of local anxieties and what is happening in Strasbourg at the university at this moment. I think you beautifully made the case with this project of your kind of mission and your direction. You try to make French history more Jewish, as you said, and the Jewish history more French. And could you say more about it? Is it something that you see happening right now in French historiography or the historiography of France? Mm-hmm. Is it something that you are doing by yourself, or it's something like a kind of larger movement?
I think, my first impulse in sort of shaping this perspective on history, this is, I think, really part of my bigger agenda, my bigger research agenda, is that it was really hard to choose what kind of dissertation I wanted to write. And it seemed to me that when I was putting together my reading list, there were two really distinct historical or scholarly records of historiography, so to say, or so to speak. And one of them was the sort of French national narrative, right? Write a book about French history, a monograph about politics, a monograph about state responses to this and that. You could write a monograph about ideology. It would be part of the French historical story, the story of France. But in the sort of Jewish narrative, the sort of turning points were quite different. And it seemed to me that there were only certain points where or the French story and the Jewish story sort of met up, right? And that would be the French Revolution, for a moment, the First World War, Vichy, and the Holocaust, and perhaps some moments of decolonization. And then again, within the past few years, with the rise of what many have seen to be, anti-Semitic acts coming from very different locations, all quite public. So Jews are really in the spotlight again right now. And it seems to me that what began as a sort of historiographical irritation for me is actually symptomatic of a greater need to understand, minority histories, or to be more specific, really the history of multiculturalism and diversity in scholarship. And so this is something I'm still sort of developing and working on as I'm working on this micro-history is, to what degree is this French history? To what degree is this Jewish history? And I still do believe that, one of the ways to look at, or one of the ways to have a more holistic vision of the past is to sort of take a smaller lens and to sort of see how all these forces interact in real time and real life. I mean, it's not the only way to do this, of course. But it's one way that I'm experimenting with, and that I feel is bringing me closer to real experiences and a better understanding of the past.
Your case study and your project right now, it's also that beyond making French history more Jewish or Jewish history more French, it puts them in a kind of European context. Mm-hmm. And that's the richness of this region, Alsace-Lorraine, and this turning point in European history. And you are dealing with the history of Western Jewish experience, and we are here in Bucharest. I would like to ask you, how is it first to be here, working on such a project, here in Bucharest, here also at New York College, in a kind of multidisciplinary context?
Well, I'll start with the second part of that question. I think what I've really needed from or for the development of this project is a set of sort of questions and proddings about the method of microhistory, which is again something quite or rather new for me. I did some local history for my dissertation, but I haven't been trained as a local or microhistorian. This is something really that I've been developing over the past year as I've been sort of designing this project. But being in a multidisciplinary environment, like the one that I've been at New York College, has offered me access to the perspectives and questions of people that have more experience working in fields like anthropology, ethnography, and that have a better sense of, or a different sense of, how to do studies of people and societies. And so as I'm sort of building from my experience here and sort of expanding the project that I came here with, I found that these questions, they've intrigued me, and they've inspired a sort of new way of looking at the past, of looking at my documents, and of sort of building stories. Now, my experience in Bucharest has offered me something quite different. As a Western Europeanist, in terms of my research, I've really spent most of my time in France, and Western Europe really is the sort of my hobby horse, or my wheelhouse. So most of my experience is here. My research is in here in Western Europe, and I've sort of been exposed to be frank, to be blunt, a very different Europe here, a bigger Europe, a Europe of contrast, a Europe with a very different sort of set of past, a Europe that often looks the same but feels very different, a Europe with a layered history that's very visible in different ways than history is visible in France, for instance. For me, it's helped me not only develop as a researcher, get a bigger awareness of where Europe is and where Europe is happening, the idea of Europe. But that also, I think, has made me more aware and more articulate about these things as an instructor. And my experience as a teacher of European history, I really believe that my research experience, my experience in Bucharest this year, in NEC, and in Romania in general, has made me a better teacher. It's allowed me to understand Europe in deeper ways. And I think I've really, in these ways, I've benefited from having time in Eastern Europe, this sort of crossroads area, another fascinating space in Europe that offers me, all kinds of examples of some of the things that we could only see in Western Europe.
NEC being this part of the city where you can feel the presence of, sort of French influence in Bucharest, but also being, very close to the Jewish quarter at this point. I mean, you've lived here 10 months
right.
in this context.
Right.
I find this very interesting.
It has been interesting for me too. One of the first things that I did when I got to Bucharest was go visit the Choral Temple, which is maybe 15 minutes walk from NEC, and a magnificent synagogue, which was actually built on the same models, a sort of copy of the synagogue in Vienna that was burned down during the Holocaust. Now, the one in Vienna was about 5 times as big as the one that's in Bucharest, but it's quite remarkable to walk into, or to even stand in front of a building that no longer exists in Vienna, and to sort of see that at the time, in the sort of late 19th century, when the Bucharest Jewish community was looking to build a place of worship, that they were sort of looking to Vienna, to Western Europe, as a sort of model. And there are lots of synagogues that sort of look like this, but really I think quite interesting to sort of see this space or this place, this location in a pan-European context. This really was a community that saw itself as part of a European tradition. And one of the other things that I found quite interesting was the sort of diversity of Jewish experiences of the 20th century in Romania. I'm not a specialist in the sort of broader history in Romania of the Jewish community, but what I do find fascinating and what I did find intriguing was my sort of comparison between the cases of Northern Transylvania and Bucharest in the context of the Second World War. I was in Cluj, and being in NEC has offered me an incredible opportunity not just to learn about Bucharest, but to explore a bigger country and a bigger set of experiences. And to sort of bring it home, I think my visit to Cluj, to Northern Transylvania, a place that saw massive Jewish deportations in 1944, really gave me a sense of sort of diverse, tragedies and responses in the context of a singular, supposed national history. This is a very different region, a region that saw a very different experience of the Second World War and the Shoah. So I think that, as far as my own personal experiences in Romania have been, I think I've learned so much, not just about, Romanian history, about the city of Bucharest, about, modern urban history, how it works, and this is the most remarkable case of a city being shaped by and shaping experiences of people living in it. But really, a different set of Jewish experiences and experiences of the Holocaust and of the great tragedies of the 20th century.
Erin, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.